Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This lecture is just a simple introduction to the concept of ethics, and we're asking the question, what is ethics? So to begin with, we just want to move down to the scientific definition. Scientifically, we might define ethics as a study of the moral beliefs and practices of a people or culture, or a descriptive account without any normative judgment. So if we're thinking about just giving a definition of what ethics is, then we're talking about what the people believe about the moral life, or what kind of normative judgments they might make. So when we talk about normative, we distinguish that from descriptive. So a descriptive account is saying, here's what it is, right? You have the flu. A normative account would be, hey, it's probably not good for you to have a flu. Let's give you some medicine for that. Okay. So descriptively, we might say Johnny hit Bobby with a pool stick. Normatively, we might say, Johnny was right to hit Bobby with a pool stick because Bobby was trying to hurt someone. So when we talk scientifically, we're talking about a descriptive account here. But if we look more about how we use this term in philosophy, we can think about ethics as composing three normative activities. And some of these activities are going to rely on descriptive accounts. So just as I said, if we want to understand whether what Bobby was doing and what Johnny was doing, we might give a descriptive account, but there's also some normative content that we would also want to say about that. So if we wanted to talk about, for instance, abortion, we might give a descriptive account. How many? What percentage of that? What are the reasons they might give? And then we might want to start making normative judgments about those. So we might say, well, the conditions that apply here might justify an abortion, or we might say that the conditions never justify an abortion. And so then we're talking about the normative aspects there. And we'll come back to that throughout the semester. So when we think broadly speaking here, then we can divide ethics into three types. So philosophically, we said it involves these three types. The three types are going to be ethics, morality, and applied ethics. So when we use the term ethics here, what we're really talking about is the study and evaluation of moral principles and beliefs. So ethics is going to be the broad category. Sometimes you might hear this referred to as meta-ethics, or you might hear it referred to as evaluative ethics. But the idea here is that what we're doing is evaluating, so we're making judgments about the moral principles and beliefs that we might have. So the emphasis is on evaluation, and it's a highly theoretical emphasis. Okay, so some of the questions we might ask involve the coherence and the practical application. So when I say that, philosophically speaking, we might divide ethics into ethics, morality, and applied ethics, that's only for classification purposes. We can't really divide those when we try to evaluate moral principles. We don't know what they are until we study the second aspect, and then we have to understand how they apply in order to really evaluate them. So ethics is the broader category here. Morality, then, is a system of moral principles and values to guide behavior, form beliefs, and our emotions. So here we're talking about a system. We might talk about deontology, which is typically associated with Immanuel Kant, and it is about obligation and duty. Or we might talk about utilitarianism as a system, which is about the greatest good for the greatest happiness. We might talk about virtue theory or feminist ethics or even feminist care ethics versus some other kind of feminist ethics as systems. So if ethics itself is the evaluation of moral principles, morality is the system that unites all these moral principles together. Now, obviously, part of the problem with ethics today is that we have different kinds of moral systems, and so part of our job is to evaluate those different moral systems. And there's not one system that brings really every moral principle into play. That would be almost an impossible task in some ways. And so we're looking at different emphases. So by the end of this course, you might realize that you started out as a utilitarian, but now you're a deontologist, or you started out as a deontologist and now you want to switch to you really believe feminist ethics. So these are some of the things, and those come about by the evaluations that we do. And then finally, the third aspect is applying the ethics, applying the moral principles. So if we have a deontological system that emphasizes obligation or duty, then we might ask, well, okay, how do we apply that in a specific case? Or are we ever allowed to lie, for instance? Or are we ever allowed to kill someone? So here we're taking the principles of the system and applying it to see how it works in a real life situation. So again, the focus is on application. And we cannot evaluate a moral theory or a moral principle without really understanding how to apply it. That would make little to no sense. Just as we couldn't really evaluate a physics theory without knowing how to apply it. And that's part of the point of science, really. So ethics we might break down into ethics, morality, and applied ethics. These are normative issues, so we're making judgments and we're making evaluations of different moral principles and applying the principles to specific cases to make judgments about those cases, but also to make judgments about the moral principles themselves. So there's a back and forth that happens here. So when we use this term moral, we might come to a question, well, what do we really mean by this term? Typically, we might talk about it as a normative term, that it's all-encompassing, that it supersedes other categories. We might talk about principles or codes, actions, behaviors, values, things that give us direction in life or help us to decide what's right or wrong or good and bad. So don't get too caught up in the definitions here, but the idea is that when we evaluate a moral principle, what we're doing is we're trying to figure out what is the best action, what is the best value that we might have in this or that situation, or overall to guide our lives. Excuse me. There's a caveat here, though, that we want to think about, and that's the question, why be moral? Each moral theory should be able to answer this question from its own terms, right? If we have a moral theory, one of the things that we're asking it to do is not only give us directions on what is the right or wrong action, or the right values to have, or the right beliefs to have, but why we should have these values, these beliefs, or do this action. And so ethics helps us to answer the question and judge whether the theory that we are using satisfies its own criteria. Does it live up to human experience? So the thing that we want to be careful about here is when we try to separate off the moral life from the rest of our questions about living in the world. And that is to kind of put it into a category like the frozen vegetable food that you're supposed to avoid in the supermarket. Yeah, it might be good for us, but we don't really need those frozen vegetables. Let's go and do something else. And that's fine, perhaps, if we go grow our own vegetables, but most of us don't have time for that. So we end up going to, for example, the processed food aisle and buying cereal, or we go to the fast food restaurant. My point here is that we can't separate out the question of why be moral and what the right moral thing is to do from the rest of our lives, just as we can't separate out vegetables from the rest of our lives. We have to integrate it so that we understand where we're going in life and that we can become fulfilled, or whatever it is that you think is most important about being a human person. So in the end, this very brief introduction is just to say that ethics is the study of moral theory, which can include normative principles, values, or emotions, and is applied in specific and concrete situations. What we're going to be doing is ethics throughout the whole semester. We're going to look at different moral theories, and we're going to apply normative principles to specific situations to evaluate both what people should be doing, but also to evaluate the normative theory itself. Thank you.